Hello and welcome to episode 1C of Mjolnir, the miniseries. And for those of you who don't know, we've been looking at the miniseries GBH. So you'll want to watch episodes 1A and 1B, obviously, before you watch this one, or rather listen to it, I should say. So we're looking this time at episodes 4 and 5 of this miniseries by Alan Bleasdale. And let's have a little recap about what happens, basically. If we can just have a little plot overview of episode 4. Would someone like to take that?
I think this is the episode where you start double questioning yourself about who is who in the series. Nobody's really who they seem to be, but I think episode 4 is the episode that shifts, and you think, well, maybe it's not quite as cut and dry as what we think it is about these different characters. Maybe there's something underfoot going on. I think episode 4 is 5 especially. I think it really starts getting the ball rolling. What do you think?
Yeah, it's funny actually because on episode 4 I've not made that many notes really, but yet you do find out quite a bit of stuff. So I'll start with the opening, which it opens with Frank and the family in the mayoral car, which of course is taken from Michael Murray, and there's a little discussion there which might not seem terribly important or anything, but one thing I noticed was that his mother actually discusses his dad with him, whereas she doesn't with Michael. And that's a very interesting thing. That must be deliberate, actually.
She never really seems to speak to Michael about his dad. She always puts it off, and he seems to get quite upset that she's not sharing what he was like or what he used to do, and it seems to torment him.
Even when directly asked, she says, "Oh, I don't remember, and I would have taken more pictures, I'd have done video if I could have thought of it," and just shifts the subject and shrugs it off.
That's right, yeah. Then after that, we cut to Michael Murray, who's in his office, and he's got this lackey, basically, who is blackmailing this private eye, this Philip. He's sending him to find both Eileen Critchley and his mother, but it's really more important in finding this Eileen Critchley, who we've mentioned, who was his nemesis at school. She phones him while he's in the office, getting him to find her, and then hangs up, of course. Now she's not really, of course, Eileen Critchley who phones him, but his nervous tics are worsening as well, if you notice.
It's very well played, but physical acting there, the comedy.
That's right, yeah. And apparently that was the actor's own decision to do that.
Ah, well, it certainly added a lot to it.
Yeah, it gives it quite a tragicomic element to the character, I think. The other thing I noticed in that scene was, of course, he has a black secretary. If you notice, a lot of the people who he relies on are non-white, and this is foregrounded in later episodes.
And in an early episode, that same black woman, the secretary, she was the one he had scrubbed and brought to her tent, you might say. In one of the earlier episodes, when he was opening up, I think, the Caribbean club, he picked her out the crowd and said to his assistant, "Oh, have a word sent to her." So he's obviously sort of surrounding himself with these people he's sleeping with and using.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you get the impression that he's sleeping with her?
The way he was eyeing her up and the way she was eyeing him, I got the impression that was probably what he was doing. But I'm not entirely sure, I wouldn't bet it, but that's the impression I had from how he was behaving, that perhaps that was part of his interest.
Let's be honest, I mean, I know this might sound a little bit strange, but she's not like the girl's revolting. I mean, he could have picked some like massive obese black woman with a big afro to be his secretary, but he picked out probably the best looking one of them. And you can tell that he's kind of got an eye for her, you know?
Yeah.
Because he's sort of sorting his hair and stuff. He was sort of preening.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned it, I can see that, yeah. I think that you're right. Because he does have this weird kind of exploitative attitude towards ethnic minorities, as well as this benevolent attitude to them at the same time.
That was the way I looked at it. I thought it was this two-sided thing with him.
Yeah, very, very much so. He's like that with all of them. If you look later, we'll be looking at that waiter at his hotel who he's got the job for. But he definitely has this weird relationship that is both exploitative and paternal and benevolent and so on at the same time. And that is very much a far left attitude towards ethnic minorities. If you look at it, it's like we had this scandal last year with Oxfam. Was it last year or the year before? I can't remember which. But where Oxfam, these really middle class white young men and women, were going out and giving handouts to Haiti and wherever, and to these camps as well in Calais, where you have the immigrants there waiting to get over to Britain. And at the same time as they were giving them stuff, they were also having sex with them and using it as a bargaining chip and so on. This seems to be the norm, and very much quite a middle-class leftist white thing that's going on, this odd relationship between them and the ethnic minorities. You see, our position is basically just to separate. You know, you have your bit of land over there and we have our bit of land over here. We don't want anything from you. We don't want to give you anything either. And that's it. But the left have really weird issues.
Yeah.
And if you notice the way he acts around the woman Barbara, notice he seems to hug her quite a lot in that episode. In fact, he hugs her quite a lot throughout the series. And it's not like a manly hug where he would embrace a woman and like show her strength and make her feel comfortable. He seems to be hugged by her, and he rests his head on his shoulder. So he's defender of all these blacks and ethnic minorities, and he's the white knight for them. But at the same time, he's very, very weak, and he needs mothering a lot by this woman, despite he's this hero for ethnic minorities. Like a very sort of divided nature in the guy.
Yeah, it's a bit weird because she's a complete stranger.
Yeah.
And yet that seems to appeal to him. I think that that's the case also with the ethnic minorities, in that the stranger they are, the more these people seem to love them. And that's the same with this character, Michael Murray.
That's right. We find out later on in the series who she is and how she's involved with Michael. But even still, the way he acts around her, it's not really what a strong man who is fighting for the rights of ethnic minorities you would expect him to be like. It seems to be that he is almost missing this part of his life, and he needs mothering constantly, which is why when he sends out the private investigator to look for Irene Critchley, he also asks him to look for his mother as well. So he's got this dependency to find out where his mother is at all times.
But that is down to his source of motivation for it. None of his motivations were ever pure or grounded in proper roots. It all stems from his inadequacies, weaknesses, and the traumas of his childhood.
Mm-hmm. But would you say in episode 4 and 5 as well, I would say that you start seeing him in a slightly different light, where you see that he's not really a complete shitbag. He's not a particularly evil character. He's very rash and he's very aggressive at times, but he's not altogether a completely bad one. And you get this impression that maybe his past is why he was developed into what he is today. But at the same time, there is a little bit about him that makes you think, well, maybe he has got these people's best interests at heart.
That part, I think, felt a bit forced, like Bleasdale's trying to make an excuse for a guy who has been the sort of icon of left-wing politics in this series. Bleasdale could never go full on and say, he's corrupt, he's dishonest, and this is what the left is like. He had to reel it back a bit and give him all sorts of excuses for his behaviour. You know, that he's not an evil guy, it's because there's evil Tories manipulating them, or there's something else manipulating them. There's always going to be something to give that wee bit of wiggle room, which you won't get with the right-wing characters, of course. They're presented in a more two-dimensional format. Especially the kind of the Tory puppet masters, and even at the working class level, you're showing the Nazi punk at one point, which is a ridiculous figure in this thing, which is Bleasdale's own thoughts coming through, because he's showing all these thuggish left-wing characters. So what does he have to do? He has to have the most ridiculous, most completely irredeemable scumbag with a swastika lapel and a Union Jack t-shirt to really label him up visually quickly and make him completely irredeemable to make up for all the bad-looking leftists.
We're going to come on to that guy because he's in the next episode 5, but we'll get on to him because he's a strange and interesting character. I think that there is a genuine feeling for ethnic minorities in Michael Murray simply because he feels betrayed by his own people in a way, because of these incidents in childhood when everyone pretty much couldn't be trusted of his own. And that's an interesting revelation by Alan Bleasdale, because what that's basically saying is that this is what the left are like, that actually this comes down to the fact that they haven't been able to trust their own people. But if they're from the left and they haven't been able to trust their own people, then what does that say about the left?
True. And also, it continues to give the revelation of their method where they bandy together all the outsiders and the people at the edges, band them all together against the majority in the centre.
Yeah, very much so.
And that's Michael's sort of motivation. That's what drives him so much, I think. As he even says himself, he felt like an outsider, so he identifies with the outsiders, and that's all he cares about now, to the detriment of his own.
Yeah, and the thing is that, Michael Murray is basically an archetype here, an archetype of one of the kinds of leftists. And so this does not reflect well on the left in general.
Might have something to do why this series isn't talked about so much or promoted.
Exactly. Yep, exactly. Now, of course, on the other hand, you have this idealized figure of Jim Nelson, and Michael Murray's trying to bring him down. We've got this meeting with the director of education, a new director of education, and he suspends Jim Nelson, of course, and he plans to close the school and sell off the land for a supermarket, which appeals to Michael Murray very much, doesn't it?
Of course, he'll know you get some kickbacks because you're showing earlier on he's get kickbacks for construction. And of course, he might get funding for whatever projects he's already promised but doesn't have the money for.
And he's got this deep, obvious hatred for school. He obviously didn't have a happy time at school, so probably any opportunity to tear one down and try and make amends for his youth, I suppose.
Yeah, that's probably part of it as well, the petty revenge from childhood, which continues.
Yeah.
But it's also interesting in that what you've got here is this capitalist ethic on the left. Now, the left have always said that they're against capitalism, but yet here you have him rubbing his hands and can't wait to get a hold of the filthy lucre. And this is how the left have always been, of course. This is what we've got now. We have the extreme left hand in glove with capitalism, which they've always said is right-wing, which is nonsense, actually, because it comes from liberalism. But you've got the socialist left and the liberal left, which is where capitalism comes from, working together, even though they've always said that they're complete enemies.
Well, you need one to rely on the other. I think they both go hand in hand, don't they?
Absolutely, they do, yeah.
But that's the realisation you've got to get to understand what's going on, I think, in the world.
Yeah.
Which a lot of people, unfortunately, even on what they call themselves the right, just haven't realised this yet.
No, that's right. The thing is that if you take the left as a grouping, meaning everything from liberalism down to communism and so on, if you look at the theory, it's all based on economics. That is their God. Their God is economics. Whereas the proper right, economic things are subservient to stuff like glory, the greater glory of a people. Money is basically used for progress in a proper way, for building great architecture, for creating great art.
Long-term thinking.
That's right. For war as well. I don't mind saying that the right does have a war ethic as well as, which is problematic in the modern day, the post-industrial age, but traditionally that has always been the case as well as. And for religious belief and these kind of abstract ideas. But economics has always been subservient to those things, whereas with leftist thought, meaning anything, again, as I say, liberalism, socialism, communism, all those kind of things, it is paramount. And people are economic units that serve the economy. When capitalists and communists, when communists get power, they talk about productivity. If you read Orwell's 1984, they always talk about the productivity, how many X amount of units we've got out this week, and it's better than the week before and so on. This is what it is. Why, for example, is the seminal text of Karl Marx called Das Kapital.
Sounds familiar, that word.
And of course, you look at all the Soviet Union's own propaganda, internal or external, it was all about production, be it shoes, bread, whatever it was. That was all their justification for everything they did, from the gulags to political oppression.
Yeah, and so people have made real philosophical mistakes when they look at the left and the right, apart from people who really know what they're talking about when it comes to history and philosophy. Most people see the present day and the political spectrum that we've got now, but they don't see how the Overton window shifted. And what used to be the left, the old left, is now considered right wing, which means the liberals, because the liberals used to be the left and now they're repackaged as neocons and so on. But all they are liberals of old. Those outside the Overton window, they're the proper right, who used to be normative at one time. Now, coming back to things, we've got this scene next with Jim, and he receives his letter of suspension, and then the chairman of the Labour Club turns up at the same time at his house, which is convenient, and takes him to see these thugs at his club, doesn't he? What do you make of this scene?
Well, at first you think it's going to show the dirty side of Labour, but of course it's then spun as you find out the fact that, it's actually the evil right-wing people that are manipulating and getting these people to brigade the local Labour club. All the kind of local Labour people are good boys who never done nothing.
Yeah, I made a few notes on this scene, which is that they're called football hooligans by this chairman of the Labour Club. I thought that this was very peculiar because the left always portrays football hooligans as being the far right. But actually, football has been a huge leveler, and the left has brought all its propaganda in through football, really, a lot of it anyway, through all this give racism the red card and all these little groups. Of course, they've brought black players over. One thing I could never understand was when they threw bananas onto the pitch to the black players and so on. If they were so up in arms about it, why didn't they just clear the terraces and not give their money to the football club?
Don't buy a season ticket, vote with your wallet.
Yeah, that's right. It's very easy to do. And it would have either finished the football club or they would have towed the line and got people from the local area and trained them as football players instead.
And importantly, it is also doing something that nobody can complain about legally.
Yeah.
You just walk away and not pay for something, entertainment you don't want.
Yeah, but this again shows the commitment of capital to leftist causes. And so they've always worked hand in glove because the free market is the great leveler. The free market knows no race, it knows no color or creed, knows no ethnicity, doesn't care about culture so long as you can sell it. And so, as I say, people have made huge mistakes about the left. Now, there's the irony, of course, here about Michael Murray. He's tried to get Jim suspended from the Labour Party for bringing the party into disrepute. Of course, you have this irony here there. It was interesting that when you have these football hooligans, Jim berates this lack of equality and social justice. Did you notice that? A lack of equality and social justice he talks about. It's basically mouthing leftist slogans all the time between the normal stuff.
Yeah, he does sound like basically a walking copy of the Grooney ad, no?
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing is it shows how old this term is as well, because this is 1991. And people think that all this social justice warrior business has only been out in the last few years.
Yeah, that's something that's definitely worth emphasising. Is a number of times I've talked to people who are amazed to see propaganda in televisual or film media from the 90s. And they've no idea. They don't realise this stuff goes back decades, even before GBH, and it predates obviously the 90s, but it goes back much further than that.
I was watching a video recently of a band I was a fan of when I was a teenager called Typo Negative, and I watched this old interview with them. It reminded me that this stuff does go very far back because Antifa were trying to get them banned from a music festival in Holland because one of their songs had I'm not going to say it because I don't want to get put in jail, had the N-word in one of his songs. And I thought Antifa existed even back then. all these people trying to shut down songs or words or lyrics or bands for being a specific way are being banned, and they were done for anti-Semitism. But the keyboardist is Jewish, and he wrote like the song. And it's like even back then it was complete fucking lunacy.
Yeah. Well.
Oh yeah.
There's tons of these films and stuff you can find 60s, and no doubt if you keep digging, you'll find more and more right back to almost the dawn of it.
Yeah, it goes way back, and it's just the same. Maybe it's increased now because we have the internet and we have more ability to communicate with each other, but it was pretty much the same.
Yeah. And then after that, we get this little escapade with Barbara, and she goes to visit Mr. Weller to try to get the file on Michael Murray. She, of course, flutters her eyelashes at him and everything, and he actually gets the courage to show a response. And
only done that about 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. But it all goes horribly wrong, of course, doesn't it?
Mm.
Poor Weller.
Yeah, he's a horrible little man, isn't he, really?
I think you get the impression that he could have been nicer if things hadn't gone and driven him off the bend. Because he seemed all right at one point, And then he seems to get more comical and more unhinged as this pressure's piled on him. Because it's hard to imagine somebody that unhinged as he became could have continued in the job that he was in.
Is it episode 5 where he writes a letter? Or is it episode 4 or 5 and he writes a letter and he says, we can all go a little bit crazy sometimes. So you can tell that this guy's not completely there.
Yeah.
I think he was completely broken by Michael's return and the manner it was. At least in the story, all these things obviously is through Bleasdale's eye, we've got to remember. And that was, as we discussed before, Weller was deliberately a flawed character because of his politics.
Very much so. It's interesting, actually, that with Barbara, of course, she claims to be Eileen Critchley, and we find out that Weller actually knows that she isn't, because he knows that she died in her first year at Oxford. And so the ruse is suddenly seen to be completely fake. And then he gains strength all of a sudden. Do you notice how quickly he turns?
He grabs her hand and pats her in the hand. Remember that? He reassures her.
Earlier on, before that. Yeah.
Was that before that?
Yeah, that was earlier on when they were still quite sweet. But at that point, though, you remember he completely turned against her. She was chased out into the rain when he realised the ruse.
That's right, yeah, that's right.
He got very angry, and as Dave said, he suddenly had this sort of strength of will to argue his case and chase her out. He'd have probably attacked her at that point in some manner.
Yeah.
Look at if he hadn't been so clumsy and she'd got away.
But you notice that character, though, it's almost like he was originally became that way or started down that dark path after he was effectively rejected by Michael's mum. It was that bitterness that kind of changed him, because he beats Michael up, doesn't he, with the belt?
That's right, yeah.
So I think it kind of all stems from Michael's mother. He sees women as dangerous. He's a creepy little guy. I don't know, maybe it's just me. I just think he's a creepy little guy.
Yeah, he's certainly written in that sort of negative manner, because in real life, what would have happened was he'd have tried again somewhere else. He wouldn't have sat for 30 years pining after somebody that's gone unless he was a complete numpty.
Yeah.
But that's how the story has to be justified. This is Alan Bleasdale's view of a character he's created, so you've got to kind of ride along with the story. But you can point out the unreality of such a person. In real life, it wouldn't happen that way.
The other thing is, as well, why he becomes a bit unhinged is because he thinks that Michael Murray sent her, and that Michael Murray is basically out to get him. Whereas the plan is actually for Barbara to get this file, this school file, on Michael Murray that shows that he was basically a degenerate at school, and then give it to Bubbles, who she's with in the car, who's the guy from the right-wing newspaper, essentially the whatever version of the Sun it is. It's never said what newspaper it's from, but we can imagine that it's something like the Sun. It's a tabloid.
Yeah, is he supposed to be Jewish? That guy? I know we talk about this a lot.
No, he's got a Scots-Irish name. Is it something like Maguire? I think.
Okay,
if I remember rightly.
Okay, no, I just wondering. He just looks a little bit tiny, little bit. I was just wondering.
The guy who plays him, Peter Hugo Daly, I don't think he's Jewish at all.
He was in Sharp with exactly the same accent and played almost the same character, but in Napoleonic times, I recognise him. He always plays sort of petty villains, it seems.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, it just seems like a little bit of a sinister guy who's just like out for money, doesn't really
Weasley.
care what he writes about. Yeah, like a little weasel. Yeah.
I think he's just good at playing that kind of character, and he gets cast in that role.
He's got that kind of face, hasn't he? Unlucky.
Yeah, although
Yeah.
not unlucky if you're an actor and you get money for it. Some of these actors have made good money out of what you think was an ugly face. He also had the world's worst fake moustache, has to be mentioned. The Bubbles with a fake moustache while he was waiting for Barbara to come out with it. At first I thought, did he grow that in the intervening time to cover the scar? But then you see soon after it's gone, so it is actually a disguise moustache he's put on. As if you're not going to recognise him just for this tiny moustache.
Well, nobody recognised Clark Kent, despite the fact he was like battling people in New York. Nobody recognised him because he put on a pair of glasses.
Yeah, and don't forget in one of the films, this is an aside, he actually has a double date, remember? And he keeps leaping back and forth.
Yeah. I think moustache will do it.
Yeah, so maybe you can get away with that in the film. Well, Bleasdale thought, that's sensible. Even though he's wearing the same suit, the same bow tie, he's got the same hair.
He never has a change of clothes, does he, in the entire series, I think?
I don't think so. It seems to be the same thing, because even at the hotel when he was brawling with Michael Murray, it was the same outfit again.
Yeah, that's right. He's just got that one suit to his name.
Which might not actually be unrealistic, to be honest, because he maybe just wears that for work because he thinks, well, I'm writing for a respectable paper, so he turns up in his bow tie with his kind of horrible suit.
Yeah.
That's right, and it always looks too big for him.
Yeah, it's ill-fitting, this baggy suit, like he's kind of got it off his dad or something.
Yeah, like a hand-me-down.
Yeah, that's the impression you get. It's some sort of hand-me-down, and you think he's probably not got a lot of money, but he's working for the paper, so he's got some, but not enough to justify himself getting a decent suit for the job.
I think it makes him look sleazier, and I think that was the impression that Bleasdale wanted to give, actually.
Is that a Flash Harry?
Yeah, Flash Harry, but doesn't quite do it quite right.
Yeah, Dim Harry.
Yeah, I think you're right there.
Now, we've also got Jim becoming more and more unhinged. He's talking and walking and undressing in his sleep and so on. So we've got a parallel here between Michael Murray and Jim. Did you notice that?
Yeah, and there was a really, I felt quite uncomfortable scene where the kids are apparently excitedly watching their dad undress, including almost his underpants.
Yeah, I wasn't sure about that scene. I was like, what
yeah,
the fuck am I watching?
That's what I thought. I thought it was kind of funny at first, he's mucking about, and I thought, what the fuck, these kids are sitting in chairs at waist height. They wouldn't be laughing, they'd be screaming and disturbed.
Yeah.
Funny things going on in the Bleasdale house, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what's going on there, because I've never heard anybody joke about that when I was at school. I've never heard anybody talk about that in adult life as some sort of funny incident. That would be extremely weird and disturbing if somebody described that in their childhood. And yet this was treated as hilarious game till the mum walks in and stops it at the last half second before it happens.
Yes.
And the kids, 3 kids are all sitting there watching this like it was television and all happy and making fun.
Of course,
Very
in the
weird.
next episode, it does happen.
Yeah, of course, but
That's right, because he goes for a wander around the moors naked, and his kids come along with his pants and his socks, and the wife's got the jeans in her hand. The end of the episode, he's naked in a bar.
yeah, that's right.
He gets naked all up.
He does, but I think it's almost forgivable when he's just going a bit doolally and wandered out and they've got to drag him in. But when they're almost egging him on to do it when he was in the house, that was the disturbing part. It's tragic when he's gone doolally and he's taken his clothes off and walked outside naked, but when you're kind of laughing about it and the kids with their own dad, that's weird. It's a totally different tone to it because of the way they're letting it happen and almost encourage it instead of just waking them up and stopping them. It's actually quite cruel as well, of course.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you got a guy who's obviously disturbed by his own mental breakdown and these kids are egging it on.
That's right. It's a very odd family, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
I started to notice, though, dare I say it, that I started to dislike his character more and started liking Michael's more. Episodes 4 and 5, I started to shift who I was behind, because although Michael's a bit of a shitbag, I was wanting him to see what was being done to him and happen upon it and discover that he was being used. And I was kind of rooting for him more. And the further I seen the other character going down, just becoming just more disturbed, I started to dislike him a little bit more, if I'm honest with you.
It might be because they gave so many excuses for Michael Murray's character and behaviour, where he's had this baggage from his past, as we talked about in earlier episodes, and now you see, he's been manipulated, the puppet masters are controlling him, and they're deliberately doing this, they're winding him up, causing the tics, and changing his mind and directing him, or threatening him, or pressuring him. So you're given this endless pile of excuses for him, which then puts Michael, instead of, as he was, a locally very powerful man, into an underdog position, which you'll then naturally enough sympathise with. So there's a bit of a trick in the narrative to change Michael's position from a power figure, as he was earlier episodes, to an underdog, while because Jim Nelson's such a flawless character, you then can look at his flaws more critically, because his flaws are from within and his own problem and his own family, and he doesn't have this litany of excuses. There's no background to excuse him.
Yeah, that's right. There's no backstory. There might be some that I've completely forgotten about, but there isn't like a backstory in the same way there is with Michael. We don't find out why he's become so nice and so proper. We just accept him that he is. And the other guy, Michael, has become this way for some set of circumstances. He's become bad or evil or a shitbag because of his childhood. But the other character is good just because he is. And he's a little bit flawed.
Yeah, and that shows you how a story can pull you along when you're watching it. Once you're immersed into it, even if you completely hate somebody, the story can pull you along and make you sympathise with somebody who's actually still detestable.
Yeah.
He's still a horrible person, Michael. And he's still done the horrible things that he's done in the past, and the results of them still exist. So he doesn't actually deserve any sympathy, just even at that point, but the story can pull you along with the narrative, the way it's written, and the excuses, and your brain just accepts it.
Yeah. But I think also because I think Michael still is the underdog, because he's underneath those creepy guys who always seem to lure him into meetings in hotels and shady rooms somewhere. They're above him. And sometimes the other characters, we won't ruin it for you if you haven't watched it, but some of the characters in there suddenly realize, whoa, I really never expected him to be that high up the chain. And you realize that he's the underdog, and you're kind of rooting for him, even though he is a shitbag.
But that's the trouble with the trick with the leftist style writing narrative, where there's always an excuse. Now, in reality, there's always somebody bigger and stronger than you, as the phrase goes. Well, there's always going to be, until you get to some mythical top-level world leader. But if you start at a ground level, there's always going to be somebody more powerful. You can always claim an underdog position. Even an MP can claim, oh, well, but. And then maybe a prime minister can say, oh, well, but there was somebody really wealthy, powerful told me. If you allow that type of thinking, like Bleasdale has for Murray, there's nobody takes responsibility. Everybody's an innocent, even after they've done bad things. And there's always another excuse. There's always a way you can light them as an underdog, and you end up getting nowhere because of it. I think it's his politics coming into it, framing it that way.
Yeah, that's it. And of course, when you're a scriptwriter, you can frame it any way you want.
Hand of God.
And that's right. And things can make sense that don't really make sense in real life. One thing, coming back to the issue on the degeneration in mental health and so on, is this particular episode in the hotel where there's this meeting and Michael Murray gets excluded from it, of course, particularly by Peter, who tells him that he's not required in the meeting and he has to sit outside, and he drinks heavily, of course, and his tics get worse. It's this Mervyn character, this Mervyn Sloan, who I talked about was the Tony Benn type character, who gives this revolutionary speech. And I thought that this was a strange way to end it, which was, we'll meet again in worse and in better times. And everyone applauds. And, of course, what's meant is that it'll get worse and then better, of course, because you have things getting worse, this slow progression of regression, really. And then suddenly there's this magical revolution, everything's all right. This is what the left believe, basically, that you've got to destroy everything so that then they can have this magical revolution, everything's wonderful at the end of it. That's what the extreme left actually believe.
Destroying something to build it back up again seems like such a good use of time.
Yeah, that's right. But equally, if you listen to it, we'll meet again in worse and in better times. It doesn't really specify time, and so the worse and better times can actually be together.
Or back and forth.
Yeah, it's going to be worse for someone, better for others.
That's right, yeah. Meaning people like Sloane are going to have it better, of course, and the lumpen proletariat aren't, because that's always the way Marxist revolutions work. And I think that was conscious, actually, because the thing why the left don't really like this series, the extreme left, is that he does not like that revolutionary Trotskyite and Stalinist faction at all. He's not a Marxist-Leninist.
Yeah. There is honest criticism of the left in this as well. I mean, although we're obviously carefully picking through this and finding things we disagree with, there also is honest criticism as well.
Yeah, that's right. He does criticize that faction, the old extreme left, if you like, of Marxist-Leninist, Marxist-Trotskyist and Marxist-Stalinist thought, if you like, the Eastern school of Marxism. Because he's a Western school of Marxism type of guy. He's a Frankfurt school type. He's a deconstructivist. He's a post-Freudian and so on. So he's of the Western school of Marxism that emerged out of, well, places like Frankfurt and eventually took over all the institutions in the West. So there is that to it. Now, equally, of course, while this meeting's going on, you've got Murray, whose mental state is degenerating. And it's degenerating, really, because he's losing social control. Did you get that idea?
Yeah, as things slipped through his hands and he looked weaker, the twitches get worse.
That's right, yeah. And then after that, you've got this scene where these leftist thugs, these football hooligans or whatever, are being sent out by Peter to beat up that black waiter. That black waiter, of course, he's just saved Michael Murray from his wife, who's seen as this real horrible virago, actually. I'll come back to that in a moment. You have this scene in which Peter sends these thugs out to beat up that black waiter. Normally, that's what they associate with the far right, isn't it? This is how they portray the far right, as going out and beating up black people and ethnic minorities and so on.
Yeah, they don't seem to realize that there could be somebody above them who would deliberately make it look like it was a right-wing attack when it was actually leftists doing it, like their own false flag. If we're capable of doing it and they're capable of doing it, everyone is, of creating a scenario which rallies one group of people against the other. It's not specifically right-wing.
Yeah, which the series shows them dropping the warrant card to try and build up the idea of evil right-wing policemen beating up minorities. And you see the bit with the policeman saying, "Oh, I've spoke to them a lot. I know it definitely wasn't us. I've got hints of it's been somebody bigger," and they don't believe him. You know, the minorities don't believe the policeman is obviously representing his local station to try and convince him that there aren't these attacks. Never mind the fact that the attacks are absurd. You know, the idea that the police would drop a warrant card at every single sitting, you know. It's so too good to believe.
Right next to them.
Yeah. Once is astonishing incompetence. Multiple times is just absurd. Here's my ID.
And one of the officers he shoves it in the guy's fucking mouth.
Puts it in his mouth as well, you know, like just to really make sure.
Yeah.
And at that point, they're saying, "Oh, who is it then?" And they go through the list of possible candidates, NF and so on. So he gets a kind of a few in there, Bleasdale, to kind of just remind you they're out there.
But at the same time, he also makes out that it wasn't them. So he's kind of doing them a favour in a way. He's taking the spotlight off them and saying, well, you know what? The NF, who might have been a big thing back then, maybe they aren't responsible for everything bad that happens. Maybe it is people who are on his side, getting up to all kind of sinister exploits. It's
phrased in a way, though, that makes it, oh, naturally they could have done it. Kind of like somebody would talk about the KKK in America. It's something that nobody would question. And he's phrased it that way. And I don't think that was accidental. You know, all these attacks, well, in this narrative it might have been, you know, this did it, but and you know, normally it's actually these nasty right-wing people doing it.
That's right, but isn't it actually what the far left have always done with ethnic minorities? And that is to agitate them against the status quo, to bring them over and then agitate them.
Didn't even Malcolm X say something to the effect of the biggest problem black people have are liberal whites who think they can be our white knights?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or something like, maybe said it a little bit more poetically than I can manage, but he said something to that effect.
Yeah, very much so. It's always been the left who've tried to agitate, because, of course, once we had a homogenous society in Britain, and in fact in most of Europe, we had quite homogenous societies, and the left decided to bring ethnic minorities over to further their political agenda, agitate them against the status quo. They knew they would riot, because we've had race riots ever since they came. They first tried it in 1919, straight after the First World War. There were riots then, so they knew. And then, of course, they brought them over in 1948, and there were riots within the first few years, race riots. Of course, in Bleasdale's own town of Liverpool, in 1981, so 10 years before this was written, or at least produced, this miniseries GBH, there was the Toxteth riot. And it's interesting how he always blames the right for these riots and so on, because here, of course, we've got these Tories who are organizing everything. Peter, of course, is really a Tory, and he's gathered these thugs together. He's talking to them about Stalin and that the ends justify the means and all that, and that they have to go out there and beat this black guy up. But actually, what happened after the Toxteth riots in 1981, which was under a Conservative government, under the Thatcher government, which is said to be the most evil government that ever existed, Michael Heseltine was sent up, who was the most liberal Conservative you can possibly imagine. In fact, his father was a liberal, so he comes from a liberal background, but joined the Conservative Party to make it more liberal. But he was sent up, and I remember the end of his speech about the riots. The end of his speech, and I can't find it on YouTube anymore, and I've looked for it, and that was, "They live here, they vote here." This pretty much set up things like Operation Black Vote. It also set up the Conservative Party, kowtowing to blacks and ethnic minorities and trying to create little projects for them and so on. And so this idea that the Conservatives have been terrible ethnic minorities and so on, it couldn't be further from the truth. It's been the left that have constantly agitated them.
In this series, it does get a bit mustache twirling with them plotting to agitate them and make them more militant and so on. They lay out the plan in a sort of exposition for the audience, the whole plan out as they're talking. And you realise that there's no way, if these people were genuinely of the right, they would ever want massive numbers of militant foreigners coming in. They wouldn't want all these favours. It does absolutely no benefit to the right whatsoever. Yet that's how this is portrayed, because for Bleasdale there's got to be a bogeyman to explain the left's flaws and the left's mistakes of the past. Because he's criticising certain actions, but it's much more comfortable for him to blame a phantom Tory or whatever it is.
That's right. I remember that just before the Toxteth riots, they were caused apparently by this stop and search policy that the police had. Well, of course, if the blacks are doing the majority of the crimes, it's going to be black people who are being searched. And they said that this was racist, but it was really this local magistrate, councillor, and chair of the Merseyside Police Committee, Margaret Symey, who was a sociologist as well, and of the extreme left. And she started off this idea that they should go on a riot. She said that they would be apathetic fools if they didn't protest. So she pretty much set these riots in motion. Now, going back to what I was talking about earlier about this Virago, this wife of Michael Murray's, whose face we never get to see. Again, in this scene in the hotel, we only see her legs as she's marching up and down looking for Michael Murray, who's in the first parts of having this affair with this Barbara. She's actually in the right, and yet she's portrayed as being horrible.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing that Bleasdale chose to dehumanise somebody who's clearly, I would have said, a sort of victim of very poor behaviour by Michael. You see that she's obviously keeping a very nice home. She cares about her kids. She's got 3 kids with them, and she's looking after them because you see the kids all look healthy and well-dressed, clean, and she obviously cares about the marriage. It's not unreasonable for her to be phoning up asking what's going on because he is a dirty dog.
Yeah. Do you think they're doing it in a way to try and make it look like his perspective on her and what he thinks of her, that she's just maybe just a set of legs? And that's all she is when you see her being portrayed on the screen. It's just a set of legs and a voice on the end of a telephone that nags him. Is that like a way to show how he sees her or how he views her?
It could be to give her that, again, dehumanisation, make her this monster. But as Bleasdale is the hand of God in the script, he's writing this. He is deliberately dehumanising to make you sympathetic with him, despite the fact he's doing horrible things to her. Because if you gave the two of them face to face, if you'd imagine this was a terrible talk show and they were putting out their stories, what you'd have is one woman who's concerned and is wondering what's going on, and another guy who's just a very undefendable character altogether in that relationship. So he's got to bend over backwards to make you sympathetic for Michael instead, and they give it even him a comedy moment. And she's fuming and coming to this hotel to confront him. So she's doing everything to sort of solve the problem and get a straight answer.
Yeah.
Beyond all reasonable expectations, he keeps on trying and trying, while he's at worst made out to be a sort of buffoon, a weak man, and a comedy figure, when really he's actually, again, the villain in this relationship.
Yeah.
But Bleasdale backs up. But this also conflates with a scene in the earlier episode we talked about where Jim Nelson's friend is having an affair with a young student. And Jim Nelson, the great moral crusader, is completely okay with it and just makes a joke, even though he's close friends with the wife that the guy's cheating on. And he just shrugs it off and says nothing and keeps it quiet. He doesn't rebuke him and say, that's kind of abusing your wife's trust or anything. It's just treated as accepted.
Which is why, like in episode 5, I think it is, when they're having the discussion at the caravan park, where he doesn't seem that bothered about the guy's story about how he's going to forgive her when she gets back. And little do we know that she's been having an affair behind his back.
Yeah.
And again, did you notice that this affair also seems perfectly acceptable?
Yeah.
It's really, Bleasdale seems to be promoting this idea of cheating and infidelity. It's perfectly fine.
It's a very strange sexual morality all through the series. You think that we're talking earlier on, the creepy thing with the kids and the dad, you get the affairs everywhere, the cheating, and people just accepting it. Michael Murray, Jim Nelson's friends, and on it goes. It's quite a repeating pattern, even for very different characters. We're not talking about is something just for one character types coming through. This is something that seems to repeat for very different people.
Do you know what I think it is about the character of Michael Murray's wife that he really detests? And that she's a low-class character. She's a working-class white woman. And he seems to detest those. If you look at Murray's mother, for example, she's seen as an idiot, basically. She's low intellect. She's doddery and half senile, and his wife is foul-mouthed and vulgar and domineering. Whereas if you contrast that with Barbara Douglas, who, don't forget, is of the hated Conservative Party, she's put on a pedestal.
Yeah.
And this, for me, is Bleasdale. Bleasdale is exactly like Michael Murray, actually. He wants to be like Jim Nelson, but he's like Michael Murray.
What he's drawn to versus what he wishes.
That's right. He really likes the idea of going up and leaving his class behind, and he doesn't like the women of that class, probably because they rejected him when he was young and so on. He's married, of course, this Jewess, and he has it in for women of a lower class, of his own race.
I think most writers, when they're writing stories or scripts, especially this one where there's 2 main characters, if you're writing that story well and you're wanting good rounded characters, you have to put about 50% of yourself into the good guy and 50% of yourself into the bad guy. So he probably is writing himself in 2 different characters.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. But I think he's more Murray than he is Nelson.
Yeah. He has to be both to a certain degree.
He says in an interview that Jim Nelson was who he'd want to be.
Yeah, that's right, yeah,
so
he does.
It's even confessed, essentially, that this is who the characters are. It's who he wants to be, who he probably is, and various other biases and sort of feelings. I suppose it's not outrageous for a writer to write about what he knows best, but it then informs you, obviously, some of his own sort of proclivities.
Yeah. Going on to the whole sexual aspect and everything, in episode 5, you have this really long scene, and that must be quite deliberate, where Barbara's just going on and on and on about how good Michael Murray is in bed. It's about 10 minutes long, that scene.
That's right. And she repeats it to more than one person.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, she goes on about it quite often during that episode, you're right. Again, I think it's because of Bleasdale's own sexual fantasy.
The Gary Stu situation, where of course Gary Stu's going to be fantastic in bed with the woman he wants.
Yeah. But of course, it's Michael Murray who's this flawed character and everything, and corrupt and so on. But yet, he sees himself in part as Michael Murray, just as he does Jim Nelson. And so he's got to have this sexual power over this Barbara Douglas, this upper-class woman from the Conservative Party. Oh, dear. What a twat. Anyway.
It is falling into a lot of stereotypes here, isn't it? Things
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that D.H. Lawrence always said is that whatever you write, the truth will out. You'll want to write something, but actually people will be able to read the reality. People will be able to read the truth of it. And he was right. But yeah, interestingly, you get a juxtaposition again between Jim Nelson and Michael Murray, because the first scene is of Jim Nelson wandering around on the moors naked, sleepwalking, and then you get Michael Murray naked on the bed. So you have the two there juxtaposed, naked.
That's right, yeah. You know, she also gives him a lot of compliments, even to himself and to one of the other characters whose name I forget. She compliments him on his sexual prowess in bed, and he's surprisingly good, and she gives him a lot of good compliments. She's like a strange character in that sense. It's almost like she's trying to destroy him. Well, she is trying to destroy him. We find that out later on. Sorry to ruin it for everyone, but at the same time, she's got this sympathy and, I suppose, lust towards him in a way.
Yeah, well, originally it's excused as the fact that she has to build him back, because they destroy him, of course, in episode 4. There's a mass of nervous twitches and everything. But she's sent to cure him again because they couldn't get the file on him that they need to give to the press to destroy him completely. And so that's the reason she's sent. But you also get this feeling that because he slept with her and is so good in bed that she's basically started to come round to him as well as.
Yeah.
And Murray does get off on the sexual prowess that he has. It does cure him of his nervous twitches and everything. The thing that he notices straight away is that his twitches are gone. And really because this has given him a perceived amount of power again.
Yep. Yeah, he does that weird twitch where he keeps on doing like the dance move where he flicks his wrist up into the air. And the other characters, like, he grabs himself and he's like, calm. So they've all got these weird sort of twitches and things they do.
That's right. And in fact, we get this new thing in this episode, which is, well, it's not new actually, but it's progressing, which is this fear of bridges that Jim has. I don't know what you make of that, what the psychological significance is of bridges here. They must signify something. Have you thought about this?
Well, in Scotland, crossing bridges traditionally is something that witches and fairies and things like that can't do. If you want to outrun one, you have to jump over a stream or a river of some kind to escape because they can't cross flowing water. And I think they say the same thing about vampires. Vampires can't cross bridges because of the flowing water. It's something like that. Up here, anyway, it is.
Yeah.
That's right. Unless, of course, they're water nymphs.
Yeah. Or seals.
Kelpies and
or mermaids.
All sorts of other monsters we've got.
Right. So you think he's a fairy then?
No, I think there's maybe some kind of, well, possibly, but there must be some kind of deep reason for having a fear of crossing bridges, being scared of the dark or whatever. Closet doors being open.
Closet doors being open. We're back to fairies again.
We're going round.
Does it explain why he's scared of going across bridges?
I think the bridge thing was maybe just another harmless flaw, because they had to put flaws in him and give him various neurotic tics to kind of blow up and make him look vulnerable. There's a toll on him. I've heard of folk having fear of heights and fear of bridges before, and I think that was just picked out because it's one that they could fit into the story, because of course the holiday is part of the story, the Great British Holiday, so they could build it up over time, that these bridges that he's scared of. But I don't know if it actually meant anything beyond just giving him some sort of twitch.
Is he scared that it collapses, or he drives off it, or he gets stuck on it?
I've never had a rational answer to people I've known that have had these kind of fears. It seems to be just, it is an irrational fear. I mean, same when you ask somebody that's frightened of a lot of bugs, they don't actually believe if you sit them down and the bug is going to turn on them and consume them whole.
No.
But yet they'll still be scared of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course we have that skinhead Nazi scene as well when they're on the way to the holiday that they're having. Is this forced, do you think? They've just thrown that in just because they have to have a pop at the right every so often, or the perceived right, I should say.
I think that was there to balance the left-wing thugs that they've kept having to show over and over again, because they'd shown too many left thugs who you couldn't give excuses for, like the guys that were sheep stealing, and like a lot of the manpower used, even though they might blame a Tory for manipulating. In the end, you still had all these people ready to throw coins at Jim Nelson and threaten little children. All these violent, dangerous-looking people. So you needed something to counterbalance it. So they went for the most ridiculous stereotype. Because up to now, we never had anybody like Freedom for Tooting, Citizen Smith. Nobody went that far in this. There was nobody full-on ridiculous outfits. But here we've got the classic Nazi punk who's swearing, shouting, throwing beer at them, threatening women and children with a knife. So they made him absolutely irredeemable. You'll note there is no excuse for him. He just appears, he drops out the sky and becomes this violent maniac. So you're given no sympathy, no dialogue beyond his threats, and then you get the reaction to that.
Yeah.
I think that was a very deliberate part of the story, because it doesn't actually serve, narrative-wise, much else, because what do you have? You have Jim acting a little crazy, but we've had Jim acting a little crazy in a number of ways that didn't need to be expressed in this moment. So this was a scene that Alan Bleasdale obviously wanted in the story, I think, to counterbalance what we've seen before.
Yeah.
I think also it's to get in the feminist aspect in at the end as well, because Jim, of course, chases him in his car, tries to run him down, and then you have this voice of reason from this Mary Sue, his wife, who comes up with this violence doesn't solve anything, all this Guardian leftist nonsense and everything.
Yeah, he doesn't know any better.
Yeah, that's right. I think actually it's the left's always tried to portray itself as having the politics of anti-violence as well. And even when it's not true, it's like they always had this campaign for nuclear disarmament and so on. They were always very supportive of that. That was very much a left-wing group. And the Labour Party, of course, was always anti-nuclear weapons, which is why it was unelectable during the 1980s. I think that this is part of it, that it's the politics of anti-violence or perceived anti-violence, because, of course, they have been involved in some extreme thuggery, but got the media to portray them as anti-violent. And I think that this is part of it.
You could see that he's there to justify one side. It's back to this violence and counter-violence, depending how you frame it. If one side's always portrayed as counter-violence, then even though you don't actually know what the situation is, but it's how the media portray it. If the media portray it as counter-violence, and now Bleasdale saying, look, we see, you might have seen all these violent people, but here's the justification for it. If we don't, there'll be these denim-clad thugs with swastika pin lapels, threatening people with knives and throwing beer at them.
Yeah. You notice it was a Stanley knife as well, British.
I did.
Yeah, it wasn't even a proper knife. It was some like...
But I certainly think that his Britishness was foregrounded there. And he also had little Union Jacks and so on.
The T-shirt, prominently showing the big Union flag T-shirt as well, the whole chest, because I paused it to look at it. I couldn't recognise the writing in the T-shirt, But I'd be very interested to find out what that T-shirt print was, because he's obviously got it from somewhere. It's not one done for show. But it was done to make him look like a kind of British nationalist and whatever else.
That's right. So nationalism versus the left's internationalism and so on. Of course, again, you see the similarity between capitalism and socialism on the left, the internationalism. Now, coming on to the holiday itself, because they go out into this, it's a bit like a Centre Parks before Centre Parks became a thing, isn't it, really? Do you think that this little jaunt is justified? Or is this just some weird kind of excursion that Bleasdale has? What's this all about exactly, this bit of the narrative? Because it takes up quite a chunk, actually, of the series.
As I understand it, he originally wanted the series to feature a holiday more heavily. So remember that was actually a remnant of earlier writing and scripts.
One thing I can get over was, even back then, it looked like quite an expensive place to stay. It didn't look like a cheap place to stay.
No, it didn't. And that's one thing that is heavily foregrounded here. Again, is the thing on class Bleasdale's obsessed with. Because the working class always go to the coast, of course. They go to the seaside. But these very much have middle class sensibilities. So they go to this like little Centre Parks place where they can play cricket with the children. And it's in this wonderful old building with chalets around in the woods. You definitely have a middle class sensibility here as opposed to a working class one. And of course, you realize at this point that the left are abandoning the working class. That with the propaganda in this series, the working class are very much looked down upon. I notice in favor of both the middle class and ethnic minorities. And that is exactly the way, of course, that New Labour will go, first under John Smith and then under Tony Blair. And particularly bring that, when Tony Blair gets elected, into the government. So this is very much because the art often foregrounds the actual act in society. And this is it.
And
this
also,
is what we're looking at.
If you notice as well, what did Jim Nelson, he goes out to the woods in a nice resort way out in the countryside with his writer friend. You can tell he's got a big house, so he's probably got quite a bit of money behind him. Where did Michael's mum and brother go on holiday? They went to a beach resort, some crummy hotel by a beachside. That looked really quite kind of, I don't want to say low class and sound disparaging about it, but it didn't look quite as luxurious as Jim Nelson's holiday.
Yeah, very much so. Frank, of course, they've gone to the seaside, of course, and Frankie's got this job, hasn't he, as a deckhand.
Yeah, and he said it was always his dream.
That's right, yeah. Because he used to work in the Merchant Navy, didn't he? And then he gave it up, and he's felt as though he's been dead inside, he says, without it. Yeah.
Does his mum not say, not the Merchant Navy, not the proper Navy? Did she not demean him at some point? Can't remember what episode it's in. I'm sure the mother says something to the effect of, he wants to be in the Merchant Navy, not the proper Navy.
I can't remember that.
Yeah, I remember how I can remember. I think it must have been episode 3, possibly.
And
you can tell when she says it, it really hurts him.
But again, if you notice in that scene when they're in the hotel and Frank talks about it, he says, everyone has a dream. And then his mother says, no, they haven't. And the camera pans out to the masses of working class people in this hotel restaurant where they're at. They're all zombies. That's right. They're all like zombies and going about their mundane lives, not talking and everything, just sort of eating slowly.
There were a lot of them elderly, so I wasn't sure if the joke was maybe the fact that these people are at the end of their life, so it's hard for them to have these kind of long-term dreams, especially of careers, when they're, 70s, 80s.
The other scene that's quite close to it, which is like a mirror reflection on it in a way, is the scene in the chalet bar restaurant where the police come over to have a word with Jim, and the owner of the establishment walks in, and it's like the same scene, but like in a different room, in a different hotel. And he says, police are here to see you, CID. And they all sort of stop eating and look around. because that's their excitement, that's their entertainment at their breakfast table. At the breakfast table at the hotel, they're sitting around tables eating like zombies. I thought it was an interesting sort of difference.
But if you notice in this hotel, in the middle class hotel, they're a bit livelier.
Yeah.
They're more vigorous, they're more alive than they are in the working class hotel. And I think that, again, this is Bleasdale disparaging the working class. He really does not seem to like them at all. It's interesting because in Boys from the Black stuff, which he did 10 years prior or something like that to this, he's very much pro-working class. And he's gone. Just like the left has gone, just like the Labour Party has moved away, he has as well. So 10 years prior to this, he's very sympathetic towards the working class, and now he's not. He's moved away from them. We ought to look at Boys from the Black stuff at some point as well, just to compare it with the series, actually.
Interesting candidate, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And what about the end scene, folks, from episode 4? We get this. I know we're kind of moving on to episode 5 now, but I'm surprised nobody mentioned what Barbara is doing with the silk scarf when she's got it draped around Michael's neck.
Oh, yeah. See, obviously, I'm not speaking as a fact here. It's just supposition interpreted from a TV series, but it feels like part of Bleasdale's interest here coming through.
Yeah, because she's got the choke marks on her neck, and I think it's episode 4 or 5. The wee lassie, she's got the choke marks on her neck, and you get this reference that she's setting up to hang this guy.
I think also it's a reference to her sister, of course.
That's right. You ruined it. That's the end of episode 5, isn't it? When we find out that they're sisters.
Yes,
it's like the Game of Thrones moment of 1991, by the way, folks.
That's right. Because we're on episode 5 now, so we might as well give it away. Yeah, Barbara and Eileen Critchley are sisters, and we've found out already, of course, that Eileen is dead in episode 4.
Yeah.
So she's taken a place to get this perceived revenge on Michael Murray for her sister, because her sisters, before she died, she said that she's got to get him, that it's her turn now, and that it's easy to get.
Yeah.
So
it's really a good TV show because it all unfolds slowly, and things that you think, like for the first 3 episodes, maybe halfway through 4, I genuinely thought that Barbara could be Eileen. I thought she could be her, just like pretending to be someone else, and I was wrong completely. But when you find out it's her sister instead, maybe it was obvious for you guys.
No, I wouldn't say it was obvious at all. In fact, you could easily imagine writing the story as it was Eileen. Did she actually have to die story-wise as she did? You could have rewritten it as her coming from the past, genuinely. It would have changed elements, but it could have been written certainly up to episode 5 almost identically.
Well, I think that actually Bleasdale let the cat out of the bag too soon here, I'll be honest. I think that he should have saved that for later episodes to keep the suspense.
He obviously never watched Empire Strikes Back.
No, Michael, I am her sister.
Yeah.
No!
Obi-Wan told you she died. she did. Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, so at the same time, of course, that they're at this holiday camp, you have these big revelations about how things work while the Conservatives are ransacking Jim Nelson's house to try to get this file while he's away. I think that actually that's a bit of bad writing, to be quite honest. I think that everything was told rather than shown.
That exposition dump moment, I would say, is usually when the writers goofed and realised, oh no, I'm this far and I've got to get all this information out that I couldn't tell more cleverly. Everybody meets up, they all meet up and start talking and telling the audience what's going on.
Yeah.
It's pretty bad.
That's right, yeah.
And Bubbles is sat there, obviously the representation of the audience, to give you an excuse for these people to talk about what they all already know. So Bubbles has to be dragged in for some reason and given all this information.
Yeah, It's
Shoddy.
and of course you get this big cheese from the Conservative Party landing in a helicopter just in case you haven't got it, even though we've seen these men in suits earlier on in the series.
But in reality, they would just do a phone call or a letter or send a representative. Certainly for Bubbles, you wouldn't have this huge conference just for Bubbles.
And what does the guy say right at the very end? Something like, well, I think we've told you just about enough for just now. It's like, well, and the audience, thank you very much. So that means you're going to tell us a little bit more later on.
Yeah.
Why not just tell us now? Now you've told us you're going to tell us later on down this series. What am I going to wait for?
There's a couple of moments where you get this obvious exposition dump that shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
Because there's other parts where he tells a very clever story through characters' behaviour. We noted ourselves the way Michael Murray was showing, his hang-up, especially in the first episode where you get the cut as he looks up to the headmaster's door and it goes back and forth between childhood and adulthood. Things like that are clever, but when you just have people all sit down and tell you a story, I think, well, I may as well read it out of a book.
Yeah, and it was pretty obvious. They didn't really need to do that scene because anybody watching up until that particular point knows that's what's going on. But for the fact that they had to go into like an entire scene where they explain it and break it down to this journalist, it's almost insulting. It's like, do you think they got it? Do you really think they understand what's going on? Well, just tell them accidentally, deliberately.
Yeah, could it be a case where it's partly Bleasdale's mistake in writing, up to that point, and he should have, if he decided that he had made a mistake, what he should do, actually go back and refine the earlier episodes, especially as this isn't a long-running production. He writes this and then it'll go into production. It's not an ongoing thing, like, say, The Simpsons or some soap that never stops. But could it also be a case of Bleasdale underestimating the audience, where he thought, I better not be subtle, I'll just dump all this right in their lap so they can't possibly miss the story?
I think so. I think that's exactly it. I think that he's basically taken his audience for fools.
It's a real crime as a writer, to aim low like that and compromise your...
Yeah, because as a writer, you always want to make your audience feel intelligent, more intelligent than they actually are, whereas here he's done the opposite.
As for the test of time, it then becomes a flawed production. Could have been just that wee bit better. Despite the fact, as we all said, it's a good series, especially compared to most stuff now, but there's these things mar it because you can see the good in it, so the bad bits stand out all the more.
That's right. There's a nice bit of writing. Some of the speeches are quite nice, like there's a good one where Murray's bollocking Mervyn, Lou and Peter, and he berates them all for their racism and so on, with this black to agitate the blacks and Pakistanis and whatnot. And Peter says that he's scared, and Murray says back to him, you know what, I noticed this years ago. You spell scared and sacred with the same letters, and sometimes I think they mean the same thing. I think that's a beautiful bit of dialogue.
It is. There's a lot of good writing in it.
Yeah. Which then makes it all the more shame if he's capable of that good writing. He shouldn't have pulled his own efforts down by underestimating the audience.
That's right, yeah. So there's some good writing in it. There's also some pretty poor writing. I think that the meeting that he has, Michael Murray, of course, when these blacks and they're unhappy because one of them's been beaten up by this gang of thugs and they've been dressed as the police, and we'll come on to that. But these blacks are all wanting answers, and they come in, and Michael Murray tries to pacify this black Malcolm X lookalike. Did you notice that? He got the Malcolm X glasses on. This young lad who throws a shoe at him when he says that he'd shine his shoes. And he gives this speech, which is this idea that, you walk in my shoes, walk a mile in my shoes kind of thing. It's this idea of the left, of the tabula rasa and so on. He says, what if I were black and you were white? What kind of a bastard would you be to me? And so would I be to you, or whichever way around it is. And this all pacifies them.
That would happen in real life.
Yeah, it would not work at all. That is basically Bleasdale fantasizing again.
They'd say, we should just be showing a good example here.
That's right. But this also shows the doublethink of the left here as well, because on the one hand, you've got this idea that we're all sort of allotted into these bodies ad hoc. This idea of the tabula rasa, which comes from Lockean thinking, from John Locke, who's a liberal. So that's the liberal end of the left again. And then you have this other idea, which is that Michael Murray says, I'm the one who's pushed positive discrimination. Well, equally, this is racially based, and it's the idea that they need positive discrimination because of their race. So you've got the two things there in complete doublethink.
Yeah, I know. Of course, you've got to remember that back then, most of the left were denying that positive, as they call it, discrimination even existed. That was quite commonly denied. But here we are, Bleasdale, an arch leftist, writing a story about the left, and obviously these things did happen. They were favouring one race above another. It's essentially an employment.
That's right, and they've always said that it's the other way around, that the blacks were discriminated against, whereas no, actually they were discriminating for them.
Mm-hmm.
But positive discrimination is, well, it's positive for one person, but it's negative to another. That's quite obvious.
Well,
if you're discriminating, if they're discriminating positively in one way, then it's bound to be discriminating negatively towards someone else.
Yeah.
This again is the bullshit that the left sell.
But that's just the trouble, where it's all about the power of words and framing, and this is how they play it. All just words and framing to trick you. As long as they can keep tricking you to the next thing, that's all that matters. Just keep kicking it down the road.
It's all a battle of semantics. Cognitive linguistics, it's a battle, That's and of course they're doing the same thing with things like gender now as well. So,
or sex, as we used to call it. Let's not
that's right. Yeah, that's right. Because the German language has genders, the French language has genders. People have sex.
And it used to be on forms. It would say sex, male or female.
That's right. Yeah.
It didn't say gender, and then give you a drop-down box to scroll through.
There's always a gender with the left.
Oh dear.
You haven't been waiting for all this time to say that, have you?
I think he's got some of these puns written down in cards.
I know, I think he's got them all saved up.
You set him up, I'll knock him in. But now coming back to the big finale and so on, it's this where you've got these blacks being beaten up by Peter's thugs, and of course they're dressed up as the police, and this is the ridiculous thing about it, throwing an ID card, a police ID card on the body.
More than once. Yeah, that's right. As Neil said there earlier on, he said they stuck it in the guy's mouth as well. So multiple. I mean, it's beyond believable. They would be putting it in their mouth and dropping it next to them over and over again.
Oops.
Yeah, it's.
I mean, it's almost as bad as an Israeli false flag operation, isn't it?
Yeah. Careful, Dave. I don't want to be finding a suitcase in a hotel somewhere.
Careful. I think that's how you end up committing suicide, by shooting yourself in the back of the head 2 times and then dumping your own body in a river.
Yeah. I suppose.
Or being found in the woods with your wrist slashed by a blunt penknife.
That's right. And somehow shoving tablets down your mouth after you've done it.
Yeah.
Happens a lot here.
How did they get away with Dr. David Kelly? Anyway, and this is a thing as well, that we have this discourse about the National Front getting mentioned, that the brother of this Pakistani who gets beaten up, he says that it's the National Front, and then the policeman says it's the far left, because of course you have this one character, I think it's near the end of episode 4, who refuses to participate in the beatings up.
Well, he gets beat up himself, doesn't he?
That's right, and so they hit him for it because he doesn't participate. He says, and they say, we don't want anyone going to the police, you're part of it,
He picked some really horrible-looking guys for the thugs as well. He's got the worst skin. He's got that kind of skin you usually only see in sort of drug addicts. No offence to the actor, but you know what I mean? He looks really pasty and spotty and unhealthy, like he's lived on chips since he was born.
Well, again, he's made them look very, very lower class.
Yeah.
Have you know? Yeah. So again, he really has got it in for the old white working class.
But he doesn't give a nice representation of sort of more respectable ones either. He picks out a lot of really negative ones.
That's because they're upper class. You see, this is the thing about the left. They've always been very middling. They've always come from the middle classes, from the bourgeoisie, and also been supported by the lower middle classes. This is one of the reasons, actually, regardless of the ethnic minority question, why the left have gained power is because of the spread and sprawl and expansion of the middle class in society. Because there's something about that class that is always internationalist, always obsessed by exoticism, that's always looking far away and never nearby. And so this is one of the reasons why they've brought the ethnic minorities over, because they're obsessed by them. They're obsessed by the exotic other. So does anyone else have anything to add before we draw things to a close then?
No, I just hope that people might just think about going away to watch this, and even though it wasn't written by a leftist and somebody who's clearly not on our side, I think the writers maybe accidentally exposed his own side.
Yeah.
Does anyone else get that feeling that it's kind of exposed his own side?
This is why, as Dave pointed out at the start when we were doing these, how Bleasdale found himself shocked under attack. Because some of the left obviously realised what this thing was doing. It was giving people food for thought. Even though there is a bias in it from Bleasdale's leftist position, he's still got enough honest representation here to have a think.
Very much so. And this, of course, is why he was slated by the extreme left for this series. And probably why it's never been shown again.
And why it's essentially stuck in a sort of internet ghetto now, hardly seen by people. Instead of it being syndicated, you think something like that. They're all desperate for content these days because everybody's got these hundreds of channels in every country. You think that would have been sent out constantly. They'd have been selling that out to especially Anglophone countries. A miniseries, that would be a great to fill up the air. Even these online things like Netflix and so on, that are usually desperate for what they perceive as high-class British content.
Yep, absolutely right. And of course, Bleasdale's a big name.
Yeah, he wrote that remake of Oliver Twist, the 1999 version. I think it was a TV show back in the late 90s, I believe. He's a big name.
Yep.
It's a deliberate choice, it must be, to not show this. Everybody's refusing this for some reason.
Yep. Of course, we'll look at these further reasons as we bring things to close in the next episode.
Watch 6 and 7 for the next one.
Yep. And also, if you'd like to leave a like and please subscribe below.
Yeah. Any interesting thoughts, comments, even things you maybe differ opinion on? I'm quite happy to discuss it. Have a go.
Yep. So, thanks to James and Neil.
Thank you.
Yep. And I'll say goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.